The blueprints blurred before my eyes as I stared at the legal document. Alexandra Morgan versus Richard Morgan and Diane Morgan. My own parents were suing me for $500,000. "Alex, you look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus peered over his drafting table with concern. I couldn't speak. The claim was absurd. Defendant willfully purchased property intended for family inheritance, utilizing funds belonging to the Morgan family legacy. My phone buzzed. Zoe's name appeared, and I realized I'd sent her some panicked text. "Zoe, I think I'm having a breakdown." "What happened? Are you hurt?" "My parents are suing me. They want $500,000 because I bought a house." Silence. "Then I'm coming to get you. Don't talk to anyone else about this." I stared at the summons again, hoping the words would rearrange into something sensible. The house I'd worked 12 years to afford my sanctuary. My achievement was apparently the center of a family war I hadn't known existed. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is just the beginning. You should have thought about family before acting so selfishly. Dad." In 31 years, my father had never texted me. But legal warfare was worth breaking communication patterns. When Zoe burst through the office doors, her social worker badge still clipped to her blazer, I felt some tension ease. This was what family actually looked like, someone who dropped everything when you needed them. "Come on," she said, gathering my things. "We're going to figure this out. And Alex, whatever this is about, we're going to fight it." As we left, I clutched the summons like evidence of a crime I couldn't understand. This wasn't really about money or houses. This was about something much deeper and more dangerous. The coffee shop was nearly empty, creating quiet in the city's chaos. I wrapped my hands around my mug, seeking warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "Tell me about growing up," Zoe said gently. "Help me understand what we're dealing with. Where did I begin? The bicycle incident when I was 7, the destroyed college fund, the way my achievements were met with indifference while Jason's mediocrity was celebrated. It wasn't dramatic," I said slowly. "That was almost the worst part. If they'd been obviously abusive, I could have named it, fought it, but it was just death by 1,000 cuts." I told her about my 16th birthday, when I'd saved money for fabric to make a prom dress. My mother threw it away, claiming it was inappropriate. 2 weeks later, she took Jason shopping for an expensive 8th grade graduation suit. When I confronted her, she looked genuinely confused, like she couldn't understand why I was upset about something so trivial. That's when I realized they weren't being cruel on purpose. In their minds, this was just natural order. The memory that hurt most wasn't any dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of small dismissals. Being told architecture was impractical for a girl. Having my university acceptance met with complaints about cost, while Jason's mediocre grades were celebrated because boys mature later. The worst part was how they made it seem reasonable, I continued. Dad would say, "Jason will need to support a family someday," as if my future didn't matter because some hypothetical husband would take care of me. I remembered the conversation that finally broke something inside me. At 18, having received a partial scholarship to study architecture, my father had given me a realistic talk. "Architecture is a man's field. Alexandra, you'll struggle, be unhappy, and for what? You'll just end up married anyway. Why not study something suitable, like teaching or nursing? Jason needs our support more. He'll carry on the family name, build something lasting. Your job is to be supportive, not competitive." That night, I'd decided to leave, not because of cruelty, but because I'd understood that in my parents' world, I was supporting Cast in Jason's story. So I left. I told Zoe, packed everything into 2 suitcases. And you know what? They seemed relieved, like I'd finally stopped being difficult. "You were 19. You shouldn't have had to choose between family and dreams. But I did choose, and I'd choose the same way again. Despite the summons in my purse, I meant it. I built something they said I couldn't build, and now they want to take it away. Her words hit harder than the legal language. This wasn't about property rights. This was about control, about putting me back in the box I'd fought to escape. They're not going to win, I said, surprised by the steel in my voice. Whatever this is really about, they picked the wrong person to mess with. For the first time since opening that summons, I felt ready to fight. The years between leaving home and buying my house felt like a montage of survival and small victories. Each morning started the same alarm at 5 a.m., cheap coffee, and calculating whether I could afford lunch or needed another peanut butter sandwich. Working 3 jobs while finishing my architecture degree left no room for self-pity. Coffee shop at 6 a.m. until 2 p.m., classes until 6 p.m., then Romano's restaurant until closing. I met Zoe at Romano's. She was putting herself through social work school with the same brutal schedule. "You're making yourself crazy," Zoe said countless times. Unlike me, she accepted help when offered, borrowed money from family when needed, treated struggle as temporary rather than some moral test. "I need to prove I can do this," I'd reply, declining her offers to split groceries or cover shared meals. Looking back, my stubbornness must have been exhausting for people who cared about me. The worst year was 2018 when my Honda died and I couldn't afford repairs. For 3 months. I took buses that added 2 hours to each workday. Walking final miles when routes didn't connect, my feet developed permanent blisters, but asking my parents for help felt like admitting defeat. During that period, I learned through social media that Jason had received a brand new car for college graduation, a car costing more than I'd earned in 6 months. The post showed him grinning beside a gleaming sedan, with our parents beaming. Caption, "Proud of our successful son." I'd stared at that photo for an hour, feeling something toxic twist in my chest. Not just envy, but deeper recognition of how completely our parents had written me out of their concept of family success. Instead of self-pity, I'd updated my resume and applied for better positions. If they wouldn't see my worth, I'd force the world to recognize it. The turning point came at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized firm known for innovative residential projects. During my 6-month review, Linda Morrison asked about long-term goals. "I want to design homes," I'd said. "Not just houses homes, spaces that make people feel like they belong somewhere." "That's very personal. What makes you think about belonging?" I'd decided honesty couldn't hurt worse than alternatives. I've never had a space that felt completely mine. I want to create that feeling for other people. That conversation led to affordable housing projects, recognition in design magazines, and freelance opportunities that finally allowed real savings. Every freelance check went to my house fund. I calculated obsessively. $800 monthly meant a down payment in 4 years. Extra projects could make it 3. I lived like someone preparing for nuclear winter, spending only on necessities. The sacrifice wasn't just financial. Dating became impossible working 7 days weekly. Friendships required energy I didn't have. Family gatherings were awkward affairs where I felt alien while Jason discussed his career at the firm where our father had secured him a position. "You look tired, Alexandra," my mother would say with seeming concern that felt like criticism. "Maybe you should consider something less demanding. There's no shame in admitting this architecture thing isn't working out." These comments weren't malicious. They were worse. They came from genuine inability to see my struggle as anything other than misguided stubbornness. The day I hit my savings goal felt surreal. Reviewing my account balance in my tiny studio apartment, $85,000, enough for a down payment with emergency reserves. I called Zoe immediately, voice shaking. "I think I can actually do this. I can buy a house." "I never doubted you," she'd replied. "Let's start looking." What I didn't tell her was that part of me had doubted, not my ability to save or work hard, but whether I deserved what I was reaching for. 12 years of being told my dreams were impractical had left scars I was still discovering. But looking at that bank balance representing thousands of hours of labor, I felt something I'd never experienced, unshakable certainty that I had earned this. Whatever came next, nobody could take that away. Or so I thought. House hunting with Linda Parker felt like speed dating for major life decisions. Every weekend for 2 months. We'd drive through neighborhoods ranging from optimistically up and coming to definitely requires hazard pay. The first houses were lessons in lowered expectations. One had a kitchen seemingly decorated in 1973 and abandoned. Another had character realtor speak for foundation issues that will bankrupt you slowly. And a third seemed perfect until we discovered the previous owner's exotic bird breeding operation had left mysterious wall stains. "The market's tough for first-time buyers," Linda said after our 6th disappointing viewing. "But we'll find something. Think creatively about potential rather than perfection." I was considering giving up when Linda called Sunday morning. Excitement crackling through the phone. "I have something. Just listed this morning. Can you meet me in an hour?" Riverside Heights was a historically working-class area slowly attracting young professionals priced out of trendier districts, tree-lined streets, walkable to downtown, with carefully maintained homes mixed with properties owned by people with more vision than cash. When we pulled up to 847 Maple Street, something shifted in my chest. The house was a 1930s craftsman bungalow with wide front porch, exposed roof beams, and windows suggesting someone had once cared deeply about natural light. Paint was peeling, garden overgrown. Front steps needed rebuilding, but underneath neglect, I could see beautiful bones. Previous owner was elderly, Linda explained. Lived here over 40 years. Her children are selling as is for quick sale. The front door stuck, requiring Linda's shoulder. But when it opened, I stepped into a living room flooded with afternoon sunlight. Original hardwood floors stretched beneath worn carpeting, and built-in bookshelves flanked a brick fireplace. The kitchen needed updating avocado appliances, and linoleum spoke of the 1970s, but the layout was functional, and tall windows overlooked the backyard. Each room revealed more potential. Crown molding painted over but not removed. A clawfoot bathtub beneath questionable tile work. A bedroom with bay windows perfect for studio space. But the screened back porch sealed the deal. Private. Overlooking a yard with mature trees and former garden beds. I could imagine summer evenings here, finally having space to breathe and exist without calculation. "What do you think?" Linda asked, though my expression made the question unnecessary. "I think I'm in love, which probably means I'm about to make a terrible financial decision." The asking price was at my budget's top, but Linda suggested an offer slightly below asking, with quick closing to appeal to sellers wanting simplicity over maximum profit. 3 days later, Linda called with news that made my knees weak. "They accepted your offer. Congratulations. Alex, you're going to be a homeowner." The closing process passed in inspection and paperwork blur. The house inspection revealed expected issues: outdated electrical, old plumbing, Carter-era insulation, but nothing insurmountable. More importantly, nothing that felt like someone else's vision imposed on me. This house didn't come with expectations or judgments. It was a blank canvas, waiting for me to figure out who I wanted to be within its walls. The night before closing, I couldn't sleep. I drove past the house 3 times, making sure it was real, that the for sale sign had been replaced with sold. When I signed the last paper and received the keys, they felt impossibly heavy. These weren't just keys to a building. They were proof that everything my parents had told me about my limitations had been wrong. Moving day consisted of Zoe, her pickup truck, and 6 boxes representing my entire adult life. Walking through my house with actual keys felt like stepping into someone else's dream. "Document the before pictures," Zoe announced, setting down a box marked kitchen stuff. In 5 years, you'll want to remember how terrible this looked. The carpet featured brown and orange patterns, suggesting the 1970s had exploded. Dining room wallpaper had tiny pink roses that seemed to multiply when stared at. But underneath surface issues, the house revealed treasures that made my heart race. Removing loose wallpaper exposed perfect original plaster walls. Pulling up carpet samples revealed gorgeous hardwood floors, needing refinishing, but with good bones. While removing baseboards in my future office, I found an old photograph behind loose trim, black and white, showing a young couple standing proudly before the house, which looked newly built and meticulously maintained. The woman wore a simple dress with Victory roll hair. The man was in military uniform, hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder. The back read, "Robert and Eleanor Sullivan, 1937. Our first home." Something about the woman's face seemed familiar, though I couldn't place why. The bone structure, maybe, or how she held her chin, an echo of someone I knew. 2 weeks later, my doorbell rang. An elderly woman with silver hair and friendly smile held a casserole dish. "You must be the new owner." "I'm Margaret Chen, from across the street. I brought you something to eat." Margaret had lived in the neighborhood since the 1950s and considered herself the unofficial historian. Over coffee and excellent lasagna, she filled me in on local characters and history. "This house has quite a story," she said fondly. "The Sullivans built it in 1937, right after marriage. Such a lovely couple. Robert was career military. Eleanor was a teacher before they had their daughter." My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. "They had a daughter." "Oh, yes. Little Margaret. Sweet child. Though always seemed sad. Her father was deployed during war years, and Eleanor struggled with isolation. After Robert died in Korea, Eleanor never quite recovered." The familiar feeling about the photograph suddenly clicked. What happened to the daughter? She married young, barely 18, to a man named Richard Morgan. Moved to the suburbs in the 1960s. I lost touch after that. "Eleanor lived here alone for years. Such a shame this house was meant for family." The room tilted. Margaret Sullivan, who became Margaret Morgan. My mother's maiden name was Sullivan. My mother's first name was Margaret. Did Margaret and Richard have children? I believe so. Eleanor mentioned grandchildren occasionally. Though seemed sad about not seeing them much, I got the impression there was family tension. But she never discussed details. After Margaret Chen left, I stared at the photograph with new eyes. Eleanor Sullivan wasn't just the previous owner, she was my grandmother. This house, where I'd felt immediate belonging, had been my family's home decades before I was born. But if true, why had my parents never mentioned it? Why would my father be angry about me buying what he called Jason's house if it had originally belonged to my mother's family? I called my mother that evening, trying to sound casual. "Hi, Mom. What was Grandma Sullivan's address when you were growing up?" Long silence. Finally, "Why are you asking about that, Alexandra?" "Just curious about family history." Another pause. "Your grandmother lived on Maple Street. Why?" "What number Maple Street?" "Alexandra, what is this about?" I took a deep breath. "I bought her house. Didn't I? I bought Grandma Sullivan's house." The silence felt infinite. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't understand what you've done." Before I could ask what she meant, she hung up. My father's call came at 6 a.m., jerking me from solid sleep. His voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "What the hell do you think you're playing at, Alexandra?" No greeting, no preamble, just immediate accusation in a tone that made my stomach clench. "Dad, I don't know what you mean. Don't lie to me. You bought your grandmother's house deliberately. You knew exactly what you were doing." I sat up, mind foggy. I had no idea until yesterday. A neighbor told me, "Bullshit." The profanity shocked me. "You've been planning this for years. Some kind of revenge." "Dad, that's insane. How could I plan something I didn't know about? I found the house through a realtor." "That house was supposed to be Jason's." His voice carried finality. "It was always going to be Jason's, as part of the family legacy, and you've sabotaged 20 years of planning." "What planning?" "What legacy you never mentioned." "We shouldn't have had to mention it. Family loyalty should have been obvious. But you've always been selfish, competing with your brother instead of supporting him." After he hung up, I called Jason immediately. My brother answered on the first ring, voice carrying exhaustion rather than anger. "Alex, I'm so sorry. I tried to talk him out of calling you." "Jason, what is this about the house being yours? What planning?" Jason sighed heavily. "Dad has been tracking that house for almost 20 years, after Grandma Eleanor died and her estate sold it. He kept tabs on every time it changed hands. He had this whole plan about buying it back someday and giving it to me as the Morgan legacy. But why? According to Dad, it represents the family's rise in social status. Grandma Eleanor's family had money before the Depression, and owning that house again would prove we'd reclaimed our rightful place." Puzzle pieces clicked together. "So when he found out I bought it, he lost his mind, Alex. He's convinced you did this deliberately to spite him. He thinks you somehow knew about his plans. That's completely insane." "I know, but Dad doesn't do rational when it comes to family hierarchy. He's been telling me since I was a teenager that someday I'd live in the family house and carry on traditions I don't even understand." We talked for another hour, and slowly a more complete picture emerged. Our father had built entire mythology around restoring our family to imagined former glory, with Jason as crown prince and me as supporting cast. The house wasn't just a building in his mind, it was a symbol of patriarchal success, proof he'd raised a son worthy of inherited status. My purchasing it independently represented everything threatening his worldview, a daughter who didn't need male protection, who'd achieved something significant without family blessing. "There's something else," Jason said. "I've been going through Dad's papers. Alex, I think there might be information about Grandma Eleanor we were never told, something about how the house was sold after she died, and whether Mom was actually okay with selling it." "What do you mean?" "I found old letters. It sounds like Mom wanted to keep the house in the family, but Dad convinced her to sell for practical reasons. I think he's been planning to buy it back ever since, but only on his terms." And after we hung up, I wandered through my house with different eyes. The rooms I'd been planning to renovate weren't just spaces to improve, they were battlegrounds in a family war I hadn't known I was fighting. I thought about my mother's voice. "You don't understand what you've done." Maybe she was right, but for the first time since this mess started, I was beginning to understand what had been done to me, and I didn't like it at all. Melissa Turner's law office occupied a restored Victorian mansion's first floor, suggesting competence without intimidation. When Zoe recommended her cousin, I'd expected someone young and inexperienced. Instead, Melissa was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened with puzzle-solving intensity. "This is one of the stranger family disputes I've encountered," she said after I'd explained. "Your parents claim you used family funds to purchase property intended for family inheritance, but they've provided no documentation of either claim." She spread legal documents across her desk, pointing out sections with circular logic that made my head spin. "They're demanding either property deed transfer to your brother or compensation significantly exceeding what you paid. That suggests they believe the property has value beyond market price." "What kind of value?" "That's what we need to find out. I'm requesting all their financial records related to this property, any documentation of alleged family agreements, and complete accounting of funds they claim you used improperly." The discovery process over 2 weeks revealed more than I'd bargained for. Melissa's paralegal had gone through court records, property transfers, and family financial documents with forensic precision. Your parents' case is built on assumptions, Melissa explained during our second meeting. But some supporting documents they've provided are illuminating. She handed me a thick folder. These are emails between your father and various third parties over the past 5 years. College counselors, scholarship committees, even family members. My hands shook reading the first messages. Correspondence with my high school guidance counselor, where my father had actively discouraged her from recommending me for a prestigious architecture scholarship, claiming it would distract Alexandra from family obligations and create unrealistic expectations. Another email thread showed him redirecting a small inheritance from my great-aunt to Jason's college fund, explaining that Alexandra has chosen an impractical career path and needs to learn financial responsibility. Most damaging was a trust agreement I'd never seen. My maternal grandmother had established an educational trust before death, intended to be divided equally between Jason and me. The trustee had been convinced to redirect my portion to Jason's account after my father provided documentation showing I had declined the funds in favor of independence. I had never declined anything. I'd never been told the trust existed. "This goes beyond family favoritism," Melissa said quietly. "This was systematic financial sabotage designed to limit your opportunities while enhancing your brother's." The betrayal felt worse than physical violence. For years, I'd believed my struggles were natural consequences of choosing a difficult path. I'd taken pride in independence, never knowing opportunities had been stolen before I'd had a chance to reject them. That evening, Jason called with news making the situation more complicated. "I went through Dad's home office while they were out," he said, voice carrying guilt and determination. "Alex, there are documents you need to see." We met at a quiet coffee shop, both glancing around nervously like conducting espionage. Jason carried a manila envelope he slid across the table with obvious reluctance. "I photocopied everything relevant, but Alex, some of this will hurt." The first document was a journal my father had kept intermittently, detailing his legacy plan. Entries from the early 1990s outlined strategy for rebuilding Morgan family prominence through careful financial planning and social positioning. Jason shows promise for leadership roles, must ensure his educational and social advantages. Alexandra is too independent-minded and will likely marry out of the family name anyway. Resources should be concentrated where they'll have lasting impact. But a letter made me physically sick, written by my grandmother Eleanor shortly before death, addressed to me personally, expressing pride in my early artistic abilities and leaving me a small jewelry collection, along with blessing to follow your creative dreams, no matter what anyone else thinks is practical. The letter was dated 3 years before my grandmother's death. I had never received it. "There's more," Jason said, watching my face. Dad kept detailed records of every interaction with the family who bought Grandma's house after she died. He's been in contact for years, trying to arrange first option agreements if they ever wanted to sell. The manipulation scope was staggering. My father hadn't just passively favored my brother, he'd actively undermined my opportunities while building elaborate plans around Jason's future that Jason himself had never fully understood. "I can't be part of this anymore," Jason said, voice heavy with guilt and resolution. "I didn't ask for any of this. I don't want a house bought with lies and stolen opportunities, and I don't want a legacy built on treating my sister like she doesn't matter." For the first time since this mess started, I felt something other than confusion and hurt. I felt cold, clear certainty about what I was fighting against. Jason's willingness to testify on my behalf shifted the entire case dynamic. Over coffee that stretched into dinner, my brother and I had our first honest conversation about family dynamics that had shaped our childhood. "I always knew something was off," he admitted, stirring coffee with unnecessary focus. "The way Dad would build me up by putting you down, celebrate my mediocre achievements while dismissing your successes. But he made it seem like he was protecting me from competition." "What kind of competition?" He'd say things like, Your sister is naturally gifted, but that makes her dangerous. She'll try to overshadow you if we don't maintain proper boundaries. He convinced me your independence was somehow a threat to my future success. The poisonous brilliance of our father's strategy became clear. By framing sibling rivalry as existential threat, he'd prevented us from developing natural alliance that might have challenged his control. The worst part is how he made me complicit. Jason continued. When you'd achieve something significant, he'd remind me I needed to work harder to maintain my position as head of the family. When you struggled financially, he'd point out I was fulfilling responsibilities while you were being irresponsible. I thought about family gatherings where Jason had seemed uncomfortable but never spoke up when our parents dismissed my achievements. I'd interpreted his silence as agreement, when it had actually been confusion and guilt. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I should have questioned what was happening." "You were a kid too. Dad is really good at manipulation." The documents Jason brought painted an even more disturbing picture. Emails to extended family over years, explaining my absence from gatherings by claiming I had declined invitations when I'd never received them. Financial records showing my father had co-signed loans for Jason while refusing character references for my student loan applications. Most shocking were letters between my parents and grandmother Eleanor in months before her death. My mother had wanted to keep the house in the family, but my father had convinced her that selling would provide necessary capital for the children's future. What he hadn't mentioned was planning to buy it back years later as a gift for Jason alone. "He's been playing a 20-year game," Jason said, shaking his head, "and neither of us was supposed to figure out the rules." Melissa reviewed the new documents with obvious satisfaction. "This transforms our defense completely. Instead of simply proving you bought the house legally with your own funds, we can now demonstrate a pattern of systematic deception and financial manipulation." But she warned the additional evidence would likely make our father more desperate and potentially more vindictive. People who build elaborate control systems don't give them up easily. Expect him to escalate before he retreats. Over the next week, I received multiple calls from unknown numbers, my parents trying to reach me from different phones after I'd blocked their regular numbers. Voicemails ranged from my father's cold legal threats to my mother's tearful pleas to make things right for the family. Most disturbing was a message from my father's longtime friend, Alexandra. "Your parents are devastated by your selfishness. They sacrificed everything for you and Jason, and this is how you repay them. You should be ashamed." The message revealed how extensively my father had shaped the narrative, even among family friends. In his version, I was an ungrateful daughter who'd betrayed loving parents rather than someone who'd discovered decades of systematic manipulation. Jason called that evening, sounding shaken. "Dad confronted me about the documents. He knows I took copies." "What did he say?" "He accused me of betraying the family legacy, of being manipulated by your feminist nonsense." But Alex, the way he looked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time and was completely disgusted. The pain in Jason's voice was raw. My brother had genuinely believed he was our father's pride and joy. Learning this love was conditional on maintaining prescribed roles had shattered something fundamental. He gave me an ultimatum: testify against you in court, support the family position, and continue receiving financial support, or side with you and be cut off completely. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd rather be broke and honest than rich and complicit in destroying my sister's life." The courage it had taken Jason to make that choice wasn't lost on me. Unlike me, he'd grown up with unconditional family support, financial safety nets, and certainty of belonging. Walking away from security to support someone he'd been taught to see as competition represented complete identity redefinition. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. "Once you testify, there's no going back. The way things were was built on lies. I don't want any part of a legacy that requires treating you like you don't matter." As the court date approached, I felt something unexpected, not just determination to win, but genuine hope that something positive might emerge from this ugly situation. For the first time in our adult lives, Jason and I were on the same side, fighting for the same principles. Maybe that was the real family legacy worth preserving. The courthouse felt smaller than expected. With worn wooden benches and harsh fluorescent lighting, Judge Patricia Harris was a stern woman in her 60s whose reputation for no-nonsense rulings had both Melissa and me cautiously optimistic. My parents sat with their attorney on the opposite side, my mother looking sleepless, while my father maintained rigid posture that had intimidated me throughout childhood. Jason sat in the back row, catching my eye and nodding with quiet support. "This is an unusual case," Judge Harris began after calling court to order. "The plaintiffs claim family inheritance rights to property legally purchased on the open market by the defendant using independently earned funds. Mr. Bennett, please present your client's position." Lawrence Bennett projected confidence as he approached the podium. For 30 minutes, he wove a narrative about family tradition, moral obligations, and the defendant's deliberate sabotage of long-standing family plans. "Your Honor, this house represents more than property to the Morgan family," Bennett explained. "It has deep historical significance as the family homestead, and there was always understanding that if it became available, it would be purchased for the male heir to continue the family legacy." Judge Harris interrupted. "Mr. Bennett, are there any written agreements documenting this alleged understanding?" "Not formal contracts, Your Honor, but family understandings don't always require legal documentation." "Mr. Bennett, this court deals in legal obligations, not family understandings. Please continue with actual evidence." My father was called to testify first. Under Bennett's questioning, he painted himself as a devoted patriarch who had spent decades planning for his family's financial security, only to be betrayed by a daughter who had deliberately undermined his arrangements. "Alexandra has always been competitive with her brother," he stated, voice carrying authoritative tone I remembered from childhood. This was her way of asserting dominance and disrupting family harmony. She knew this house was intended for Jason and purchased it specifically to prevent him from having it. During cross-examination, Melissa was methodical and devastating. "Mr. Morgan, you claim to have provided substantial support for Alexandra throughout her adult life. Can you provide documentation of this support?" "We provided guidance, opportunities." "That wasn't my question. Sir, can you provide evidence of specific financial assistance, tuition payments, housing assistance, direct monetary gifts?" My father shifted uncomfortably. "If she had asked properly, we would have helped. So that's a no documented financial support for 12 years, yet you claim she used family funds to purchase this house. How do you explain this contradiction?" By the time Melissa finished, my father's credibility was visibly shaken. Judge Harris watched with increasing skepticism as his answers became evasive and contradictory. My mother testified next, delivering tearful performance about family unity and heartbreak over my betrayal. But during cross-examination, when pressed for specific examples of equal treatment between Jason and me, her responses were vague and defensive. "We treated both children according to their needs," she insisted. "Mrs. Morgan, are you aware that your daughter was never informed about the educational trust established by her grandmother?" My mother's face went pale. "I don't know what you're referring to." "I'm referring to the trust fund established by Eleanor Sullivan, supposed to be divided equally between both grandchildren, but redirected entirely to your son. Were you aware of this?" That was a family decision based on practical considerations. When it was my turn to testify, I felt calmer than expected. Melissa guided me through my financial history with careful precision, establishing Independence timeline and legitimate sources of all funds used for the house purchase. "Did you have any knowledge of your family's alleged plans for this property when you made your offer?" "None whatsoever. I didn't even know it had been my grandmother's house until after I moved in, and a neighbor mentioned the previous owner's history." During cross-examination, Bennett tried to shake my testimony by suggesting I had harbored lifelong resentment toward my brother and purchased the house out of spite. I remained calm, referring back to documented timeline that proved my house search had been conducted without any knowledge of the property's family connection. But the testimony that truly shifted the courtroom atmosphere came when Melissa called Jason as a witness. My parents looked stunned as he walked to the stand, my father's face darkening with obvious anger. Under oath, Jason systematically dismantled our father's narrative about family harmony and equal treatment. He confirmed the pattern of favoritism throughout our childhood, testified about conversations where our father had explicitly stated that family resources should be concentrated on the male heir, and acknowledged that while our father had mentioned wanting to someday buy back our grandmother's house, there had never been concrete plans or designated funds. Mr. Morgan, in your opinion, did your sister purchase this house to spite your family or prevent you from having it? Absolutely not, Jason replied firmly. Alex worked for everything she has. Our parents provided me with extensive financial support throughout my life while expecting her to be completely self-sufficient. If anyone has a moral claim to independence and self-determination, it's my sister. The most dramatic moment came when Melissa introduced the hidden letter from our grandmother Eleanor. As she read it aloud, Eleanor's words of pride in my artistic abilities and encouragement to follow my dreams, my mother began crying audibly. But the real surprise was Melissa's final witness, Margaret Chen, the elderly neighbor who had welcomed me to the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen, you lived across the street from this property for over 60 years. Are you familiar with the Sullivan family history? Oh, yes, I knew Eleanor quite well. Such a lovely woman, though heartbroken about her relationship with her daughter's family. Can you elaborate? Eleanor often mentioned how much she missed her grandchildren, especially her granddaughter. She said the girl reminded her of herself, independent and artistic. Eleanor always hoped the house would someday belong to someone who would appreciate its history and potential. Margaret Chen's testimony was brief, but powerful. She described Eleanor's sadness about family estrangement, her pride in my mother's early achievements before marriage, and her regret that family tensions had prevented closer relationships with her grandchildren. In your opinion, Mrs. Chen, what would Eleanor Sullivan have thought about her granddaughter purchasing and renovating this house? The elderly woman smiled. I think she would have been absolutely delighted. Eleanor always said this house was meant for someone with vision and determination. From what I've observed, that describes the current owner perfectly. When all testimony concluded, Judge Harris called for a brief recess before delivering her ruling. During those 30 minutes, I sat with Melissa and tried to process everything revealed. The case had become about much more than property rights. It was about the right to define my own story rather than accepting the role others had written for me. When court resumed, Judge Harris delivered her decision with swift authority. This court deals in facts and legal rights, not family traditions or alleged verbal understandings. The plaintiffs have failed to demonstrate any legal claim to the property in question. There is no evidence of financial contribution, written agreement, or legitimate expectation regarding the property, she continued, addressing my parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, while I understand disappointment over family plans not materializing, the court cannot enforce arrangements that exist only in expectation, not in law. Your daughter purchased this property legally with funds she earned independently. The court finds no basis for the relief you seek. With a final gavel tap, she dismissed the case. The relief was immediate but temporary. As we left the courtroom, my father confronted me in the hallway, his composure finally cracking completely. This isn't over. Alexandra? You've destroyed decades of planning and split this family apart. Jason stepped between us. Dad, she didn't destroy anything. She just refused to play along with your manipulation. My father turned on Jason, voice shaking. You ungrateful boy. Everything I did was to secure your future. I never asked for a future built on treating my sister like she doesn't matter, Jason replied calmly. As security guards moved toward our increasingly loud confrontation, Melissa suggested we leave immediately. Walking away from that courthouse, I felt a strange mixture of victory and loss. I had won the legal battle and preserved my home, but the cost was final destruction of whatever fragile family bonds had remained. Standing in afternoon sunlight outside the courthouse, I realized something profound. I wasn't walking away from family. I was walking toward it, toward relationships built on choice rather than obligation, respect rather than control, love rather than manipulation. The weeks following the trial felt like living in a hurricane's eye, moments of profound calm, interrupted by unexpected emotional storms. I had won decisively, but victory brought complications I hadn't anticipated. The immediate aftermath was both satisfying and hollow. My house remained mine, my savings stayed intact, and my independence had been legally validated. But I'd also severed the last threads connecting me to the people who had raised me, however imperfectly. 3 days after the trial, I received a certified letter from my parents' attorney informing me I was no longer welcome at family gatherings and that any communication should go through legal channels. The formal language couldn't disguise what amounted to a declaration of war. More painful was collateral damage to extended family relationships. Within a week, I received calls from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had heard my father's version of events, a story painting me as an ungrateful daughter who had selfishly destroyed family unity for personal gain. "We're disappointed in you, Alexandra," my Aunt Linda said during a particularly difficult conversation. "Your parents sacrificed so much, and this is how you repay them." Explaining the truth felt both necessary and futile. How do you quickly summarize decades of systematic manipulation to people who had never witnessed it firsthand? Some relatives listened and began asking uncomfortable questions about things they'd observed. Others chose to maintain relationships with my parents by cutting contact with me entirely. Jason faced his own consequences for choosing to support me. Our father's promised financial cutoff was swift and comprehensive. The luxury apartment lease in our parents' names was terminated. New car payments stopped. Credit cards providing his financial safety net were canceled. I knew it was coming. He told me over dinner at my house a month after the trial. But actually experiencing it is harder than expected. I'm 30 years old, and I'm just now learning how to budget groceries. Watching my brother navigate financial independence for the first time was both inspiring and heartbreaking. He moved into a modest apartment, traded his luxury car for a reliable used vehicle, and took on additional work responsibilities to increase income. The adjustment was difficult, but something in his demeanor had changed. He carried himself with more confidence, as if shedding our father's financial control had also freed him from psychological weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I never understood why you worked so hard," he admitted one evening as we painted my kitchen together. "Dad made it seem like your struggles were unnecessary, like you were choosing difficulty to make some point. Now I realize you were learning skills I never developed, how to truly take care of yourself." Our relationship was transforming in unexpected ways. Instead of the competitive dynamic our father had fostered, we discovered shared values and genuine affection that had been buried under years of artificial rivalry. "You were never the problem," he said one afternoon as we refinished hardwood floors. "Dad needed you to be the problem to justify treating you differently. If you'd been obviously flawed, his favoritism would have seemed reasonable, but you were successful despite his obstacles, which made his treatment look arbitrary and cruel." The insight was both healing and infuriating. I'd spent years wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't earn approval that seemed to come so easily to Jason. Understanding that I'd been fighting a rigged game didn't erase the pain, but it helped me stop carrying responsibility for failure that had never been mine. My mother remained the most complicated figure in this family reorganization. 2 months after the trial, she called me directly. "I'd like to see you," she said, voice tentative. "Just me? Your father doesn't know I'm calling." We met at a neutral coffee shop, and I barely recognized the woman who sat across from me. She looked smaller, more fragile, as if the confident persona she'd maintained throughout my childhood had been a costume she could no longer wear. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you," she said without preamble. "I should have said that years ago, but I was afraid of contradicting your father. I was afraid of a lot of things, and I let that fear hurt my relationship with my daughter." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. She talked about her own childhood, about dreams she'd abandoned to become the wife my father had wanted, about watching me pursue independence with a mixture of pride and envy she hadn't known how to handle. "Your grandmother Eleanor was like you," she said, staring into her coffee. "Strong-willed, artistic, determined to make her own way. I was supposed to be like that too, but I let myself become something smaller instead. It wasn't complete reconciliation, too much damage had been done, but it was a beginning. We established careful boundaries and tentative communication, both learning to navigate relationship without my father's controlling influence. The transformation in my daily life was more subtle, but equally significant. Coming home each evening to a house that was truly mine, making decisions about renovations without anyone's approval, hosting friends without worrying about judgment, these ordinary activities felt revolutionary after years of defending my choices. But the most profound change was internal. The therapy I'd started after the trial helped me recognize patterns of behavior I'd developed in response to chronic emotional invalidation. Learning to accept compliments, to trust my own judgment, to believe I deserved good things without having to earn them through perfect performance, these skills felt as foreign and necessary as learning a new language. Standing in my renovated kitchen one evening, surrounded by evidence of my own capability and vision, I finally understood what my father had been so afraid of. It wasn't that I would take something away from Jason. It was that I would prove their limitations on me had been artificial, and that recognition would threaten the entire power structure they'd built their marriage and family around. I hadn't just won a house. I'd won the right to define my own worth. The house renovation became both literal and metaphorical therapy. Each room I transformed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been diminished during those difficult family years. The physical work of stripping wallpaper, refinishing floors, and painting walls provided satisfying, measurable progress that paralleled the more complex work of rebuilding my sense of identity. Zoe appointed herself project manager for larger tasks, organizing renovation parties that brought together friends from work, neighbors, and anyone willing to trade labor for pizza and beer. These gatherings transformed my house into a hub of activity and laughter, something I'd never experienced during childhood in spaces that felt more like museums than homes. "This is what a housewarming should look like," Zoe announced during one productive Saturday, surveying a living room full of people working on different projects while music played and conversations flowed. "Not some formal thing where everyone's afraid to touch anything." She was right. My parents' entertaining had always involved careful staging, the right food served on the right dishes to the right people, with conversation topics that reinforced their image of family success. The casual chaos of friends helping me install kitchen shelves while debating everything from local politics to terrible movies felt infinitely more authentic. Jason became a regular fixture at these gatherings. His presence initially awkward as he learned to relate to me outside the competitive framework our father had constructed. But gradually, people began inviting him independently, and I watched him develop friendships based on shared interests rather than family obligation or professional networking. "I never realized how lonely I was," he confided one evening after most people had left. "Dad's version of success was so isolating. Everything was about maintaining appearances and position, never about actual connection. The professional impact of winning the lawsuit was unexpected but significant. Word spread through the local legal community, and several people mentioned it during networking events. Instead of negative consequences I'd feared, my willingness to stand up to family pressure seemed to enhance my reputation for integrity and independence. More importantly, the experience gave me confidence to pursue opportunities I might have previously considered beyond reach. When Morrison & Associates announced an opening for senior partner, I applied despite feeling underqualified. "You've got something most architects never develop," Linda Morrison told me during the final interview. "You understand that buildings aren't just structures. They're spaces where people create their lives. That perspective is rare and valuable." Getting the promotion felt like vindication of every difficult choice I'd made over the past decade. The increased salary provided financial security I'd never experienced, and the professional recognition satisfied needs I hadn't realized I carried. But perhaps the most meaningful change was learning to accept help and support from people who cared about me. The therapy I'd started helped me recognize how thoroughly I'd internalized my family's message that my worth depended on self-sufficiency, asking friends for assistance with house projects, accepting dinner invitations without feeling obligated to reciprocate immediately, allowing Zoe to celebrate my successes without deflecting these behaviors felt foreign but gradually became more natural. "You know what's different about you lately," Zoe observed one evening as we sat on my newly restored front porch, drinking wine and watching the neighborhood settle into evening quiet. "What's that? You seem comfortable in your own space. Like you finally believe you deserve good things." She was right. She was. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for someone to tell me I'd made mistakes or taken more than I deserved. The house around us represented choices I'd made based on my own values and vision, funded by work I'd done for my own goals. The garden became my favorite project that summer. Eleanor Sullivan's original landscaping had been carefully planned, and restoring her flower beds felt like reconnecting with family history in a way that honored rather than competed with the past. Jason helped me research the original plantings, and we discovered that our grandmother had been quite knowledgeable about native plants and sustainable gardening practices. "She would have liked what you're doing here," my mother said during one of our carefully scheduled visits. These meetings were still tentative, both of us learning to navigate relationship without my father's presence, but they were becoming more comfortable over time. "Do you think she would have approved of me buying the house?" My mother was quiet for a long moment, watching me transplant perennials in the evening light. "I think she would have been thrilled. Eleanor always said this house needed someone who would love it properly, not just own it as a status symbol." The comment revealed more about my parents' original plans than my mother probably intended. For my father, the house had been about demonstrating success and maintaining patriarchal authority. For me, it was about creating space that reflected my values and provided foundation for the life I wanted to build. As autumn approached and the first year of homeownership drew to a close, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day when I'd received the summons. The legal battle had been traumatic, but it had also forced me to articulate and defend things I'd never consciously examined: my right to make independent choices, my worth as an individual rather than as someone's daughter or sister, my vision of what family should actually provide. Standing in my kitchen one evening, preparing dinner for friends who would arrive soon, I felt a profound sense of peace. This wasn't the life my parents had imagined for me, but it wasn't a reaction against their vision either. It was simply mine, built from my own decisions, sustained by relationships I'd chosen, and grounded in space that reflected my own values and dreams. For the first time in my life, I felt completely at home. The call came on a Tuesday evening in early October, nearly a year after the trial. My mother's voice was shaky, formal in the way that suggested she'd rehearsed what she planned to say. "Your father is in the hospital. Heart attack. It's serious." Complicated emotions flooded through me. Concern, residual love, anger, and something approaching relief that the call wasn't about his death. Despite everything, he was still the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped with science fair projects before our relationship had soured into control and manipulation. "Do you want me to come?" I asked, unsure what answer I was hoping for. "He's asked not to see you or Jason," she said quietly. "But I wanted you to know." The conversation was brief and awkward, both of us navigating the strange territory of family emergency complicated by family estrangement. After hanging up, I sat in my living room trying to process feelings I couldn't easily name. Jason called an hour later, having received a similar notification. "How are you handling this?" "I'm not sure. Are you planning to go to the hospital?" "I tried. Mom said he doesn't want to see either of us." His voice carried hurt that time hadn't completely healed. "It's strange to realize your father would rather face a heart attack alone than reconcile with his children." My father survived the immediate crisis, but faced a long recovery requiring significant lifestyle changes. Through my mother, I learned he'd been forced to retire early, that stress from the lawsuit and family estrangement had contributed to his health problems, and that he remained unwilling to consider reconciliation. "He talks about you sometimes," my mother told me during one of our coffee meetings. "Never directly, but he'll make comments about ungrateful children or the destruction of family values. I think he misses you both more than he can admit, but his pride won't let him acknowledge that his approach was wrong." The information felt both sad and liberating. I'd spent months wondering if I should make some gesture toward reconciliation. But learning that he remained committed to his version of events released me from that obligation. Some relationships couldn't be repaired, not because forgiveness was impossible, but because one party refused to acknowledge that repair was needed. My relationship with my mother continued to evolve slowly. She began making regular visits to see the house renovations, offering memories about Eleanor that helped me understand our family history from perspectives other than my father's controlling narrative. "Your grandmother was frustrated with me," she revealed one afternoon as we worked together in the garden. "She thought I'd given up too much of myself to keep peace with your father." She was probably right. These conversations were painful but necessary. My mother was learning to express opinions and preferences that had been suppressed for decades. While I was learning to see her as more than an enabler of my father's behavior, she'd been a victim too, the one who'd made choices that had hurt her children. The most significant development came when my mother decided to divorce my father. The decision shocked extended family members who'd viewed their marriage as solid, despite its dysfunction. But it made sense to anyone who'd observed the power dynamics closely. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life managing his anger and disappointment," she explained, "and I don't want him to have another reason to blame you children for his unhappiness." The divorce proceedings were complicated by my father's health issues and their intertwined finances. But my mother approached the process with determination I hadn't seen from her before. She consulted her own attorney, made her own decisions about settlement terms, and refused his attempts to use guilt and manipulation to change her mind. "It's terrifying," she admitted during one of our conversations. "I haven't lived alone since I was 18, but I'm more afraid of staying the same than I am of figuring out who I might become." Jason and I both offered support during this transition, helping her find an apartment, navigate financial independence, and begin building social connections outside the marriage that had dominated her adult life. It felt strange to be parenting my own mother through major life changes, but also healing to finally have a relationship with her that wasn't mediated by my father's expectations and interpretations. Christmas that year was the first I'd spent away from my parents' house since childhood, and instead of the obligatory tension of previous holidays, Jason and I hosted a small gathering at my house. My mother came, along with Zoe, a few neighbors, and colleagues who'd become genuine friends. The celebration was nothing like the formal productions my father had orchestrated, no carefully coordinated decorations or stressful meal preparations designed to impress extended family. Instead, we cooked together, played games, and shared stories about the year's challenges and successes. Sitting in my living room that evening, surrounded by people who'd chosen to be there rather than those connected by obligation, I felt profound gratitude, not for the lawsuit or family trauma that had precipitated these changes, but for the opportunity to discover what authentic relationships could feel like. The house that had been the center of so much conflict had become exactly what I dreamed it could be, a space where people felt welcome and valued for who they were rather than who they were supposed to be. As guests prepared to leave that evening, my mother pulled me aside. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," she said. "It feels like the first real Christmas I've had in years." Looking around at the gentle chaos of dishes and wrapping paper, at Jason helping Zoe organize leftovers while neighbors shared contact information for future gatherings, I realized she was right. This was what family was supposed to feel like.